This message comes from Bayer. Science is a rigorous process that requires questions, testing, transparency, and results that can be proven. This approach is integral to every breakthrough Bayer brings forward, innovations that save lives and feed the world. ScienceDelivers.com.
We see it in the news, we hear it from our friends and neighbors, so I gotta know, why are more American voters identifying as independent?
It's a logical response to become more independent in light of the fact that the two major parties are failing the American people.
They're driven to vote off of issues, not, if there's a D or an R next to the candidate's name.
Hello, hello. I'm Brittany Luce, and you're listening to It's Been a Minute from NPR, a show about what's going on in culture and why it doesn't happen by accident.
If our two major parties aren't cutting it, what is? And what's bringing voters beyond our mainstream political binary? I'm Danielle Kurtzleben. I'm a White House correspondent at NPR, filling in for Brittany Luce. I've been covering politics for a long time, and here's a statistic that caught my eye. According to a recent Gallup poll, 45% of American voters identify as political independents. And since Gallup started polling in 1988, this is the highest percentage of self-identifying independent voters our country has ever seen. Now, I can't say I'm totally surprised. For a while now, voters have understandably been frustrated about having to choose between the lesser of two evils when Democrats and Republicans square off in an election. And candidates from current President Donald Trump to current New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani got voters excited about independent thinking and politicians who are anything but business as usual. So today on the show, to talk about independent voters, we are joined by Dr. Omar Ali. He is a professor of African American political history at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. He also wrote In the Balance of Power, Independent Black Politics and Third-Party Movements in the United States. Hey, Omar.
Hi, great to be here.
And we are joined by Elena Moore, political reporter at NPR, who sits kitty corner from me in our office.
Hi, neighbor.
Hello, neighbor. So, okay, I want to start with you, Elena. I've been looking at this recent polling, especially from Gallup, and it's clear that young people especially are identifying as independent recently. Now, you cover younger voter trends. You've reported on these kind of polls. Tell us briefly about the numbers we're seeing and also why young voters in particular are not aligning with the major political parties.
As someone who covers young voters, the numbers definitely stood out when I was looking at Generation Z, and that's, folks born between 1997 and it looks like Gallup for their poll had it as 2007. And of that group, more than half, 56%, say they identify as independent. And when I saw that, I was both surprised, but also like, oh, of course, that makes sense. Because for years, as I've been covering young voters, I have seen in national polls, specifically of people 18 to 30, I've seen party identification basically become more and more split. I feel like for years it was kind of 30%, 30%, 30% roughly, of Dem, Republican, Independent. And I've been saying for years, young people don't have the same allegiance to political parties as older generations do. And I think that's reflected in polls, but it's also just reflected in the issues they support. They're driven to vote off of issues, not if there's a D or an R next to the candidate's name.
I mean, I'm also curious, among Gen Z, it's really easy for us to go, independent is neither Republican nor Democrat, must be moderate. So I want to talk about ideology. Are these independents, especially young voters, are they moderates? Or I can see some independents think the parties don't go far enough, that maybe I'm independent because I consider myself a socialist or a groyper or something like that. Where do they fall?
People are complicated, and we've been boxed in by the political culture to think that you have to do politics with a consistent set of ideological positions, and that you have to do politics via a political party. And yet there's nothing in the U.S. Constitution about political parties. In fact, George Washington warned about the spirit of the parties because he believed that it would be corrupting of the republic. And I think the young people see in some ways the corruption of the two parties, but all parties, because these independent voters are actually not running towards a third party, whether it's the Libertarian Party or the Green Party. They want to see themselves as independent of the corruption. And young people have always been at the forefront of independence in this country, from the founding fathers and mothers of this nation, who were actually relatively young people, to today, to Black Lives Matter. So there are different ways of doing politics. And I think that one of the overriding things that I've seen in American history is that independent voters have been the driving force of American democracy.
I want to get back to one thing you said earlier, Elena. You were talking about Gen Z independence being issue-driven. What issues are driving them in particular?
The one issue that really is this uniting generational factor is the economy, which is obviously for every generation. But I think for young people, and especially Gen Z, they've had a really unique connection to the economy. You know, these are people that grew up as either young teens or children during the Great Recession. You know, they've only known a period of economic uncertainty. And I think because they've seen this for most of their lives, they have very low levels of faith in the government to fix it.
I want to make sure that we're drilling down on this, or at least articulating this, because I got to tell you, I've covered President Trump a lot. I've been to a lot of his rallies. And when I've talked to a lot of his voters, a lot of them will tell me, I'm not Republican, I'm independent, I just love President Trump. Which means that, like, those people are not moderates, right? They have a very firm view of the world, and it aligns more with the Republican Party. And I think the general view is that a lot of people who tell you I'm independent really do line up with one party or the other pretty neatly. What I'm wondering is that true for these Gen Z independents, or again, does it just depend on the person?
I feel like it so depends because, you know, Trump has also turned a lot of traditional Republican norms on their face, right? Maybe a Trump supporter really doesn't feel like they are a Republican, because to be a Trump supporter and to support President Trump's agenda, that often looks different than what a traditional Republican might have been 10 years ago or 15 years ago, obviously. Also, I think it goes on either side, right? Because you hear people who always literally still identify as like a Bernie bro and feel apolitical about so many different candidates, but they're like, you know who got me? This dude in Vermont. And so I feel there are these like political icons for people that feel like they spoke to them. And I think for a lot of young people, there aren't a lot of examples of that.
I mean, another way of thinking about the support for Trump is that he has been a blunt tool to, in some ways, push back against what people perceive as problematic policies, whether that's coming from the left or from the right. So there aren't many tools for the American people to express themselves politically, given how controlled the process is.
That's fascinating. I mean, this is a thing I've been thinking about, is that these young voters, a lot of these Gen Z voters, they haven't known a political world, at least as adults, without Trump.
I think that is like the summary of Gen Z. I mean, the oldest Gen Zers are 28 years old. They were born in 1997. If you are even the oldest Gen Zer, the first presidential election you could vote in was 2016. Any civic participation on the presidential level, everything has been shaped by Trump.
That's what I wanted to ask about, is like, how has he shaped this generation? And also, I mean, I will cop to being an elder millennial, like, we were shaped by, 9/11 and the financial crisis and the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan, those things. What are the big things, I mean, Trump aside, that have shaped this generation?
I'm a cusper. I've gone on the record. I'll say it again. Gen Zers weren't like fully cognitive functioning adults during those events you just mentioned, but they're raised in a post-recession U.S., a post-9/11 world for the most part. And then at the same time, it's a generation that's grown up with increased rates of school shootings and just general political violence as well. A big call to action among young people. We've seen young Americans get really invested in politics through all of these different causes, whether that be the movement for Black lives, Trump's immigration agenda, or just broader immigration reform, the environment, women's rights, and not to mention the internet is everywhere and they see everything. And so it's a generation that's been pushed into politics online and in person. And in addition is COVID. I think we can't underestimate how much isolating and being at home for so many young kids and young adults during formative periods of their lives has shaped their politics.
Coming up,
I think one of the things that brings over so-called independents or people who don't fit in either side is when there's a candidate who actively talks about the flaws of the two parties and like kind of says the quiet part out loud.
After a quick break.
This message comes from Jerry. Are you tired of your car insurance rate going up, even with a clean driving record? That's why there's Jerry, your proactive insurance assistant. Jerry compares rates side by side from over 50 top insurers and helps you switch with ease. Jerry even tracks market rates and alerts you when it's best to shop. No spam calls, no hidden fees. Drivers who save with Jerry could save over $1,300 a year. Switch with confidence. Download the Jerry app or visit jerry.ai/NPR today.
This message comes from BetterHelp. International Women's Day is this March. Time to celebrate all women. The leaders, the caregivers, the hype friends, the how do you do it all types. Women deserve to be reminded how much they matter and that therapy offers a space to care for themselves. BetterHelp makes it simple by matching you with a qualified therapist based on your needs and preferences. Visit betterhelp.com/NPR for 10% off. This message comes from Betterment. You know when you sell a stock or any investing asset and start to feel the dread of getting a surprise tax bill? Betterment's Tax Impact Preview tool shows you the estimated tax impact of the sale, so you can make informed, tax-smart investing decisions. Get started today at Betterment.com. Investing involves risk, performance not guaranteed. Betterment is not a tax advisor, nor should any information herein be considered tax advice. Please consult a qualified tax professional.
I want to zoom out and get into more of the history of independent voters, Dr. Ali, because I want to hear what they were like in the past to kind of help us understand them today. You've been studying and organizing with the independent voter movement for several decades. So where should we even start here time-wise to understand how independent voters have changed over time?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think that, again, the way that I read American history is that independent voters of all ages, but especially younger people, have been really the drivers of change in American history as movement builders. And I think that we need to kind of make a distinction between movements and traditional party politics. So, one place to begin is, of course, the American Revolution. We're founded on the spirit of independence, but there have been basically since that time two parties, two groups, first the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and then ultimately by the mid-19th century, you have the Democrats and Republicans. But those parties have morphed over time. So, the late 19th century, you have the populist movement. You have black and white farmers and agrarian workers, sharecroppers kind of pushing back against the two-party establishment in the South with the People's Party. You have African Americans forming their own organizations, fusing with the Republican Party in pockets in the South to challenge the Democratic Party, which was the party explicitly of white supremacy in the South. Mm-hmm. And the Democratic Party changed over time. So by, the 1930s, it's a more multiracial organization. And so you have these different waves of independents exerting sort of their power through labor organizations, through formal political parties or associations. So the classic sort of example of that is the civil rights movement. The modern civil rights movement grew so large that the major parties had to respond and do something about that.
And where would you say we're at now?
We're at a point right now where the Democrats and Republicans have, in some ways, created such a kind of an obstacle for democracy, which is really frustrating for people. And so the laws are set up in this country and have been over the last 70, 80 years to make it virtually impossible to challenge either of the two major parties. And they, in public, they fight like cats and dogs. At the end of the day, they really do lock arms around keeping out these independent voters from getting on the ballot. So you have people who support both Bernie Sanders and Trump because they're looking for tools to kind of express themselves and break through the political corruption.
How does this growth in independent voters square or fit with this idea of political polarization, that we're all pulling further apart, the people are further left, and especially that the Republican Party has pulled further right? We've already talked about how these independents aren't moderates all the time, but is there anything about this growth in independence that fuels polarization or that one fuels the other? How do they fit together?
I would say that independents are responding to the kind of polarization, which is actually a function of the elected officials creating a sense that there's greater differences than there actually are between groups of people. It's a logical response to become more independent in light of the fact that the two major parties are failing the American people. And so you have more people saying, that's not what I want to participate in. And I'm going to make my statement with blunt tools, whether it is Trump, a tool, or by not voting, which is actually a decision. The two myths are this, if you will, that independents are closet Democrats and Republicans, and that not voting is in some ways a sign of not being willingly engaged, because people don't necessarily express themselves through political parties and the electoral system. And so you see people self-organizing, whether that's in the communities in Minneapolis or just in local communities in a whole host of ways which may not seem on the surface as political.
I look at states like New York that has a largish and functional third party, the Working Families Party. So when a state has that, do independents, especially young independents, gravitate towards that?
I think one of the things that brings over so-called independents or people who don't fit in either side is when there's a candidate who actively talks about the flaws of the two parties and kind of says the quiet part out loud. I feel like that's been one of the most effective strategies. But I think of both going to Mamdani as an example, the newly sworn in New York mayor. He identifies as a democratic socialist, but, he made no secret about the fact that he was running a campaign as a Democrat, but that he was frustrated with parts of the party. And I think that allows people who don't put that label on themselves to come in. And I think you could argue President Trump has done that too. He is not afraid to criticize other Republicans. And so I think that this idea of independents crossing traditional lines, I don't even think it has to be courting, a third party vote or a third party candidate's support.
To Elena's point, the candidates who make that kind of appeal to independent voters tend to win, whether that was President Obama, who really appealed to the American people, broadly speaking. And unfortunately, when he was elected the first time, he handed over his entire database to the Democratic Party, which took a different posture and said, no, we're going to go after just our traditional base, and missed a tremendous opportunity there to really expand the coalition, if you will. And then, people broke for Trump as well. And they saw, again, him as sort of not a traditional politician tied to the party. So really, it behooves elected officials to reach out to independent voters. But they're in this bind because independents have been unpredictable in some respects, and so they don't want to go after something that they can't control, which is why they have so many closed primaries, why they put a lock on so much of the process, which is really a rigged process. It truly is undemocratic the way that our political system is set up, from getting on the ballot to being part of the presidential debates or local debates and using public funds to advocate for the major parties. So, it's a thing that Democrats and Republicans have to contend with. You need their support, but you don't want to give too much power away.
We're kind of circling around the big so what to end the episode, because you're getting at something here, Omar. You've talked a lot about systems being rigged. And if that's the case, is this kind of growth among independents, could that change those systems? Do you see that happening?
It's really an excellent question. I think it's really up to the American people and people to decide what they want to do, politically speaking. And we're seeing people self-organize into movements that are outside of the parties, but exerting themselves. But I think today, in some ways, we live in this strange postmodern era where I think instilling a sense of curiosity, treating independent voters with respect and not as closet Democrats or Republicans. Because the numbers are growing bigger and bigger, we're seeing that in some ways that's being challenged in a fundamental way.
Yeah. Gen Z is poised to be, along with millennials, a bigger and bigger part of the electorate moving forward. So it's a question, how do independents vote? That's something we are going to have to keep asking. But to me, I'm kind of curious if maybe with older generations, there gets to be a point, and maybe it's already happening for some, where they, see ways of working with the parties they have and the ins they have. Because we see that even with someone like Bernie Sanders, a registered independent, caucuses with the Democrats, runs on the Democratic ticket. And so, maybe Washington, D.C. is getting to me, but it seems like we are so ingrained in the two-party system that you're even seeing among young people, maybe they're thinking about it differently, but they know the structure. And I think maybe we're just going to see people maneuver the structure differently. But I don't know if the structure is going to change.
All right. Well, Dr. Omar Ali and Elena Moore, thank you for being here. This was great.
Thanks, Danielle.
Thank you, Danielle.
That was Dr. Omar Ali, professor of African American political history at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and author of In the Balance of Power, Independent Black Politics and Third-Party Movements in the United States, and NPR political reporter Elena Moore. And I'm Danielle Kurtzleben, White House correspondent for NPR. You can come hang out with me on the NPR Politics podcast and read my political analysis at npr.org. This episode of It's Been a Minute was produced by Skylar Swenson and Corey Antonio Rose. It was edited by Nina Patuk. Our supervising producer is Barton Girdwood, and our vice president of programming is Yolanda Sangweni. All right, that's all for this episode of It's Been a Minute from NPR. I'm Danielle Kurtzleben in for Brittany Luce, and thank you for listening.
This message comes from NPR sponsor 1Password. Anyone else feel like 99% of your emails and texts are password reset codes? Trusted by millions of users and over 175,000 businesses, 1Password lets you skip the resets and sign in securely with strong, unique passwords that autofill across all your devices. You can safely share logins, store cards and files, and finally stop using your pet's name as a password. Try it free for 2 weeks at onepassword.com/NPR.
This message comes from Bombas. When you're playing sports, you're focused. Your socks should be too. Bombas engineers socks to fight sweat and cushion impact for every sport. Visit bombas.com/NPR and use code NPR for 20% off your first purchase.
Support for NPR and the following message come from Warby Parker, the one-stop shop for all your vision needs. They offer expertly crafted prescription eyewear, plus contacts, eye exams, and more. For everything you need to see, visit your nearest Warby Parker store or head to warbyparker.com.